Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dogim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me. Yeah.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about Jeremiah, Isaiah, and this week, Ezekiel.
We're back to Zeke, huh? What is it that you always quote Robert Alter about Ezekiel?
Good memory, Rick. Robert Alter calls Ezekiel surely the strangest of all prophets. He goes on to say that Ezekiel was given to ecstatic states, paranormal experiences, and even transgressing the borders of sanity. And this particular Haftarah gives us clear evidence of Ezekiel's wild imagination and an example of Ezekiel's doom prophecy against Gog in the land of Magog. But we'll get to that shortly. In the meantime, I'm Larry Herman, sitting in my Sukkah, sipping some very fine wine, and talking Haftarah today with my very good chaver, the king of cantillation, Rick Muller. So Rick, how has your Sukkot holiday been so far?
Just great. I've enjoyed spending time with both of my sons and their girlfriends. I haven't seen my youngest son since the beginning of COVID, but he was here and now he just left.
Well, that's the way to spend the holiday, with your family. Sukkot is my favorite holiday, a great time to spend with family and friends, sharing invitations to meals in our own or others' Sukkot. It's Zman Simchatenu, the season of happiness. And after the heaviness of the high holidays, when we engage in serious introspection, we are commanded to have a good time. Another example of how Judaism responds to our personal needs. It's as if God is saying to us, now that you've done the hard work of self-improvement, you deserve a break. Go out and have some fun.
Speaking of fun, I'm sure you've had some fun with your granddaughter, Millie.
We sure have, Rick. Millie is starting to relate to her favorite toys, including Bunny, her favorite stuffed animal.
Looks like Billy also has her eyes on Bunny.
Actually, Billy and Millie are practically inseparable. They seem to think that they're part of a pack. And Millie continues to work on her crawling skills.
Does Billy help her with that too?
Sure, she shows her how to use all four limbs to get around. And she's figuring out how to play a keyboard.
Another budding musician in the Herman family, huh?
I hope so. And of course, she's with us in the Sukkah, here having breakfast with me and Diane.
Doesn't look like she's all that enthusiastic about eating.
Not yet, but she's just getting started. And speaking of getting started, the Haftarah for the Shabbat of Hol Hamoed Sukkot can really get me started on just how wild and strange some of our biblical texts are.
I suppose you especially include Ezekiel in that category.
Who could not? This prophecy from Ezekiel is a feature of Jewish literature known as apocalyptic or eschatology, dealing with forecasts for the end of days. We don't usually associate this literature with Judaism, but it's there.
Or you mean it's here in Ezekiel?
Right. It's also displayed in parts of Isaiah and Jeremiah, as well as Joel and Zechariah. But the description in these two chapters of Ezekiel, from which our Haftarah is taken, is perhaps more vivid and notably includes the specific fanciful enemy or nemesis of Gog.
Yeah, Gog and Magog. Weren't they a punk rock band from the 80s?
I think they were heavy metal, but they did sort of capture the nature of Ezekiel's description in this Haftarah, massive confusion and destruction. Except in our text, there's no Gog and Magog, but rather Gog from the land of Magog. It's not in our Haftarah, but in the beginning of chapter 38, we read, Sim panecha el Gog eretz hamagog. Turn your face toward Gog of the land of Magog.
So where did the idea of Gog and Magog come from?
Beats me. But Magog is actually one of the descendants of Noah, as described in Bereshit. there's no further reference in the Tanakh except for our chapters of Ezekiel. But later, Gog and Magog appear in Jewish eschatology as the enemies of the Messiah, in Greek and Roman legends, and then big time in the Christian Bible in the book of Revelations, and even in the Quran. But it all starts here with Ezekiel.
Okay, maybe it started here, but why in the world do we read this text on Sukkot of all times? Like you said, we're supposed to be joyful. Death and destruction don't sound very joyful to me.
Well, first of all, in Ezekiel's telling, the death and destruction is of Israel's enemy, Gog, and his homeland, Magog. So I suppose in a schadenfreude kind of way, the destruction of one's enemies is kind of joyful. But on the other hand, the description is pretty gruesome, with the dead Magogites strewn all over the land for 7 months before they can all be buried. But to answer your question, I cannot do any better than the commentary in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, which suggests that there will be a grand celebration of Sukkot following the ultimate victory over Israel's and God's enemies. But I've got to tell you that I find that explanation pretty unsatisfactory. But maybe you have some trope talk that helps us out. What have you got for us this week, Rick?
Well, unlike the last few Haftarot that we've covered, this week's Haftarah is filled with fireworks and rare trope. I guess that Aharon ben Asher thought that Ezekiel's apocalyptic visions were worthy of some excitement in the recounting of the story. I'm especially excited that there are 3 pazers, even though I'm not sure of their significance. And I know you're happy to see a bunch of Kadma v'Azlaz, your favorite. But let's see if we can find an additional level of meaning from the trope before I chant each section. How do you propose that we split things up this week?
Let's divide the reading into 3 parts. We'll start with the 6 verses from chapter 38, where Ezekiel describes God's initial awesome and angry response when Gog first attacks the land of Israel. In the first 10 verses of chapter 39, Ezekiel describes how God has instructed him to prophesy against Gog, describing the doom that awaits Gog, his people, and his lands. Finally, in verses 11 through 16, we have the rather gory description of how the inhabitants of Israel will clean up the mess that Gog's destruction left behind in their land.
Sounds like a cleanup crew at the end of a frat party.
Yeah, it kind of does. So, Rick, what have you got for us in the first section?
Well, verse 18 starts with a dramatic pause, the Munach Lagarme, introducing the Haftarah. It's like Ezekiel's clearing his throat and trying to grab attention. Notice later, the last section that I'll chant, starting with verse 11 of chapter 39, that starts with the same 3 words, V'haya bayam hahu, but that time not with the Munach Lagarme, but with the more intense pazer on the word hahu. And speaking of pazers, there's 3 of them. We have a pazer on the word mipanai in verse 20 in this section.
That's what happens when you record in a sukkah.
The ra'ash of the motorcycle. But the ra'ash gadol, that's the thing. The whole phrase is v'ra'ashu mipanai, which is translated as shall quake before me. But I'm going to echo one of your common complaints about translation. The Hebrew here starts with this very dramatic, and they shall quake before me. The emphasis of the pazer being on the word before me. Who are the they? They're listed. Digei hayam, ve'of hashamayim, ve'chayat hasadeh, ve'chol haremes harames al ha'adama, ve'chol ha'adam asher al pnei ha'adama, the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the beasts of the field, all creeping things that move on the ground, every human being on earth. But the JPS translation puts the English shall quake before me at the end of all that. I like it closer to the beginning.
Me too. And I'm glad to see that I've got you to be more critical of the JPS translation.
And one final comment on the last verse of chapter 38, which begins, V'hi gadil ti, v'hi kadish ti. What does that sound like to you?
Like Yitkadal v'Yitkadash at the beginning of every Kaddish.
That's right. Ezekiel is saying, that God is saying, I will be magnified and sanctified by the defeat of Gog's army. God speaking in Hebrew. The rabbis picked this up in our prayer as magnified and sanctified shall be God's name.
Right, except in the Kaddish, it's in Aramaic. All right, no matter. The text starts on page 1260 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash, or you can follow the text that Norm puts on the screen on your screens. But first, the bracha.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
V'haya v'yom hahu v'yom bogog al admat Yisrael neum Adonai Elohim talech amati ve'api uvkinati ve'shevrati tibarti imlo v'yom hahu yeh ra'ash gadol al admat Yisrael v'rashu mipanai degei hayam ve'of hashamayim ve'chayat hasadeh ve'chol haremes haromes al hadama ve'chol ha'adam asher al pnei hadama v'nehersu ha'arim v'naflu hamadregot v'chol choma la'aretz tipol v'karati alav l'chol harai cherev neum Adonai Elohim cherev ish ve'achiv tiyeh v'nishpatti ito v'dever uvdam v'geshem shotef v'avnei gavish esh v'gofrit amtir alav ve'alagapav ve'alamim rabim asher ito v'higadilti v'hikadishti v'nodati le'nei goyim rabim v'yadu ki ani Adonai.
Very nice, Rick. Nice start. Rick, I want you and our viewers to notice something that I've mentioned before when we've discussed Ezekiel. Ezekiel has a standard phrase that he uses when he's referring to himself, or rather, the words that he attributes to God, when God is supposed to be speaking to Ezekiel. V'ata ben Adam, or ben Adam, which the JPS translates as, O mortal, and alter as just man.
And literally, it should be son of man, or in modern use, human being. But the most interesting thing to me about that, verse 1 in chapter 39, this next section, is the Zakef Gadol on the word Nasi, or chief prince, referring to Gog. Through Ezekiel's prophecy, God is establishing the high status of Israel's enemy before describing his demise. And then we have the second pazer in verse 9 on the word of Yaru, which means to kindle a fire. What's interesting here is that the word of Yaru is immediately followed by Vihisiku, which also has a relatively rare trope on it, the Tilisha Gedolah. But both words seem to be synonyms for making a fire. Both JPS and Robert Altert's translations kind of fudge on this seeming redundancy. But I think that it's a hint of the temple sacrifices. Gog's army's weapons will be burned in the holy fires kindled by the victorious Israelites.
I really like that, Rick. Really good stuff. Time to chant the first 10 verses of chapter 39.
Ve'ata ben Adam hinaveh agog ve'amarta ko amar Adonai Elohim hineni elecha gog nasi Rosh Meshech v'Tuval v'shovavticha v'shisheticha v'ha'aliticha mi'arkatei tzafon v'havioticha al harei Yisrael v'hiketi kashticha mi'ad smolecha v'chitzecha mi'ad yamincha apil al harei Yisrael tipol, ata v'chol agapecha ve'amim asher itach leit tzipor kol kanaf v'chayat hasadeh netaticha le'ochla al pnei hasadeh tipol ki ani dibarti neum Adonai Elohim v'shilachti esh b'magog u'v'yoshvei ha'iyim lavetach v'yadu ki ani Adonai v'et shem kodshi odia b'toch ami Yisrael v'lo achel et shem kodshi od v'yadu hagoyim ki ani Adonai kadosh beYisrael hine va'a v'niyata neum Adonai Elohim hu hayom asher dibarti v'yatzu yoshvei arei Yisrael uviaru v'hisiku v'neshek u'magen v'tzina v'keshet u'chitzim uv'makel yad uvromach uviaru vahem esh sheva shanim v'lo yisu etzim min hasadeh v'lo yachtavu min haye'arim ki v'neshek yiva'aru esh v'shalalu et sholalehem uvazizu et bozizehem neum Adonai Elohim.
Very nice, Rick. Thank you. That's great.
Okay, and then we have our last pazer in verse 11 on the word hahu.
But why on the word for that, as in on that day? What's so special about that day?
I'll come back to that in a minute, but let me draw your attention to a word that comes into play 3 times in these last 6 verses, so it must be important to Ezekiel. In verse 12, we have taher in the phrase leman taher et haaretz, in order to cleanse the land. Then in verse 14, we have letahara in the phrase mekabrim et haovrim et hanotarim al pnei haaretz letahara, bury any invaders who remain on the surface of the land in order to cleanse it. And then in verse 16, at the end, we have v'tiharu in the phrase v'tiharu v'haaretz, which means, and thus the land shall be cleansed.
There's a lot of cleaning going on.
And that's the point. We've switched from the emphasis on the defeat of Gog to purification of the land. And that's why we have the pazer on hahu, or that day, because we're now focusing on purification. The pazer signals the change from tameh to tahor, from defiled to pure.
Let's hope that we can all purify ourselves before the zombie apocalypse comes. Rick, take us home by reading verses 11 through 16.
V'haya bayom hahu eten legog mekom sham kever v'Yisrael ge haovrim kidmat hayam v'chosem et hi et haovrim v'kavru sham et Gog v'kol hamono v'karu ge hamon Gog ukvarum beit Yisrael lema'an taheret haaretz shiva chodashim v'kavru kol haaretz v'haya lahem l'shem Yom Hikavdi Neum Adonai Elohim Ve'anshe tamid yavdilu ovrim baretz mikabrim et haovrim et anotarim al pnei haaretz l'tara miktzei shiva chodashim yakoru ve'avru haovrim baretz ve'ra etzem adam uvana etzlo siyun ad kavru oto ham kavrim elge hamon gog ve'gam shemir hamona ve'tiaru haaretz.
Great, fantastic, Rick. Sorry for the street noise as you were chanting part of the Haftarah, but being on Sukkot, we're out.
That's the way it is. That's the way it is.
Anyways, as always, thanks to Norm Gar for the great text and musical selections. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below. And if you like our Zoomcast, please forward the link to your family and friends. We hope that you're all having a joyful Sukkot holiday. We wish you all a Shabbat Shalom and Moadim l'simcha.
Hagim uzmanim l'sason.
Or as Rabbi Ari Lucas used to say, Chaguzel.
Haguzel indeed. See you next week.